fundamental toxic femininity, such as the Onion position from one of their fake reportings of the United States military engaging in the function of using suburban white housewives in order to subvert the enemy by picking the fight and then pretending uh, as hard as she can in order to get the person who's been attacked in order to believe that they started the argument. At which point, these types of subversions, relying upon the toxic femininity, is fundamental to their concept as a collective identity as Confederates in their transsexual cult for the Soviet Union's insurgency for the revolution of communism in its complete eradication of the West and dismantlement of the United States government and society. And those degenerates, white trash, who have sold their soul to Satan in order to gain these levers, have studied the various magics around the world in order to engage in these specific toxic behaviors for max manipulation of general public and its compounding escalations based upon the available tools, at which point the ability to manipulate the various targets includes the subversion by lying to the government, which allows them to use the government as a weapon for their personal agendas under false accusations, similar to, uh, you know, any of the various abusive false accusations, which escalates by the red flag laws, by which those who would enforce against it only need the accusation to enforce the red flag laws in violation of the Constitution for the purposes of the Soviet Union's collapse of the nation of law in the complete dismantlement into abstract anarchy for the witchcraft. And this exponentially increases, such as the Nixium or Ghislaine Maxwell, who have actively engaged in these subversions for the ascension through the power system in the magic structure from these agreed RICO extortions, then materializes these various abuses for the false accusations, including their standard enforcement mechanisms, which includes the rapists, which have accelerated from the foundation all of the way up into the military, leveraging their ranks in order to engage in the function of their personal agendas, where they will court martial any of the women in the military who supports the victims of the rape, whether it's themselves or somebody else, at which point the function of using the hierarchy of the outranking officer, who will then court martial the inferior in order to coerce or compel or collapse into subjugation for that function, at which point you have these Me Too rape culture mechanisms, which are actively leveraged by those witches engaging in the various extortions for the systematic dismantlement and extermination from their toxic femininity against society itself, with, of course, its own various perks. But, of course, this does require them, in most cases, to actively provide sex to the rapist as a form of prostitution, as a form to engage in their endorsement for the witch's various spells, where they're willing to commit all of these heinous crimes that are already fundamentally a part of their core identity, but the sex pays for the service as an exchange of value. As they engage in the various deals and to cover for each other under those mechanisms, for the systematic lies in the dismantlement through anarchy under the Jewel-Blix pseudo function, similar to the function of Jewel-Blix being taken over and replaced with an alternative, or having a competing replacement as an anti-Jewel-Blix under Frazo Vulu, who would then engage in the function of his illusions in order to manufacture the function of the Jewel-Blix, which fundamentally is founded on the construct that everything in the universe will be dissolved and therefore it doesn't require any active effort, and therefore the complete dismantlement of all law into anarchy under the enforcement of compelled socialism materializes the disillusionment of good and evil and every form of power that everyone would, by compulsion, mandatorily become equal in all ways, and therefore equally poor and pathetic and degenerate on the basis of the mob function and the function of individuals being highly intelligent is then counteracted by the mob group, which is then the lowest common denominator, and therefore the dumbest, and therefore the average, and therefore the enforcement of socialism by function of them being based upon their survival as a reaction or a reliance on said group, which then compels the collapse of their individual potential into the lowest common denominator of the group. Oh, shoot. Now, the enforcement for that purpose to engage in the various advancements in the deal with the devil, such as the Faustian construct, in order to enforce their various magic spells so that they can get all of the various arbitrary amusements and pleasures and luxuries derived by the rich who could have access to anything, and therefore acquire poisoned acquired tastes, which then degenerate as functional addictions, which then systematically collapse the person consuming it themselves, which becomes the compulsory status quo operation of each and every one of them as a self-determined self-destruction mechanism inherent to the fundamental inadequacies fundamental to the type of person who would have made the deal in the first place, and this actively engrossing itself into the various stages start at an acceptable level and degenerate as they accelerate throughout the towered levels or degrees or whatever you want to call them, at which point each of the floors becomes more and more perverse until the person is fully consumed and has been transformed into an entirely different identity. Now, with the acceleration of equipment, you create greater and greater abilities to engage in that fraud by their various illusionists for manipulation, and thus the function of redactions and to control narratives then materialize the capacity for the illusionist to engage in their various spells and misdirections, and therefore all kinds of theatrical events will generate false narratives and abuse theaters and manipulations for the reshaping of society according to the white supremacist communism, which then centrally plans the economy for the white supremacists who have always been a rowdy bunch, and thus the function of clan terrorism in order to traumatize by hate crimes the general public into compliance with their arbitrary whims by the enforcement of the anarchy from these mob functions, engage in their clan rallies in order to be directed by the druids, in order to materialize the function of their traumas so that they could get the crafted society as they see fit of the unelected fellows, and therefore the function of the superior actions of the white supremacists prove the superiority of the Aryan race inherently, and therefore a different species to the rest, and thus the function of the cattles, who are the general civilian populations, have then been separated into their own group as the white, right type of white, as their own species, concentrate the use of the rape culture in order to materialize the superiority of their genetic lines against its enemy, the civilian government, and therefore the action of law enforcement by the civilian government or national security derived by that civilian government would in fact actively repel it, and therefore they engage in the function of the superiority of their species, asserting that the civilian government has no authority over that species, and therefore the superiority of that species in the two-tiered structure materializes the entire traumatization as above the law and therefore not subject to the civilian, degenerate, inferior civilian government, to the subjugating clan terrorism, which has engaged in various insurrections by the Soviet Union in order to engage in what is referred to as a unitary executive theory, and therefore hyper-concentrating all of the powers to not have a check or balance by other branches of the government, which co-own and are co-equal under the civilian government, their maliciously hated enemy. To this end, you have the ascension of this confederacy of white supremacists and communism, which then materializes those various rapes and exchanges, which has normalized and has been twisted, similar to the function of the legends of lore and their assertion towards the historic and archaeological, as was studied by the Nazis, purging throughout the pierced histories of the superiority of the Aryan race and its adventures throughout the world and time, which are, according to their magic systems, to be replayed until they culminate into Revelation's one world government, that they, as the superior race, may create from scratch their personalized Antichrist under their control. But first they must craft or have found the correct title capable of doing so, and then subjugate it to the Baal, and therefore subject to the Lord of Thunder's possessor, the king, the master, that they then would be able to extort under their counsel, and therefore engage in the various levers. To this end, the material beast, in its chaotic, demonic, fully powered form, may engage in all of the luxuries of the abuses which they feed off of, as the addiction of those abuses are fundamental to their existence, which they, for the exclusive pleasure of the power in the extortion, become actively pursuing as its own good or luxury, as an acquired taste. Now, it is said, but not verified, that there are many rape powers inside of the system, such as Hollywood and whatnot, which would actively have massive sex parties asserting the premier rapists, who would then engage in sexual acts with men and women and whatnot, despite it being homosexual. And therefore, they would assert to themselves that it is not homosexual for them to have sex with another man, but rather the assertion of dominance and power. And therefore, the acquired taste of the luxury of that becomes the exponential expansion in the satanic religion, which is fundamental to their identity, that demands the assertion, "Do as thou wilt" is the whole of the law. Or, in layman's terms, the only rule is that there are no rules, and therefore anyone who would challenge by the enforcement of a rule is the enemy of the magic system, and must be completely broken. Now, the demoralization and collapse of that system materializes the prostitution of the witches in order to engage the acceleration from the centrally planned economy, establishing wealth and status, fame, and the rest of it, which then has them willfully and happily accept the position of their Faustian deal, and therefore the exchange materializes of those who have been demoralized and therefore will lie for the Communist Party, and therefore engage in the permanent ascension by that magic structure in order to engage in greater and greater luxuries of acquired taste of degeneracies of their own senses, and therefore betray themselves as they systematically tear themselves apart part by part, until they cease to exist, and in the collective destruction of the general public, who have likewise been demoralized in their various forms, acknowledging that law enforcement will not happen as a construct, as the cops refuse to do service of law, and therefore there is no protection of the public, and therefore there is no duty to protect and serve, materializes the function of no longer relying on the government in the same manners, requiring hyper alternatives, as the function of the civilian government has broken down in its entirety in certain places, which then requires them to protect themselves, hyper accelerating the purpose of the Second Amendment and having to do so at an escalating rate. To this ends the materialization of that witchcraft view the Second Amendment as a retaliation against the corruption feeding the growing of their fungus, and therefore the ascension of their psychedelic experience materializes the retaliation in hatred and contempt for those who would posture the acceleration of the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, and to the end of the various defenses, such as a gun or a knife or body armor, or imagine this, legal defenses in that government that they're breaking down with the corruption, turning it into refusing any function of the enforcement of the rights of the civilian population being conspired against by these satanic witches, having engaged in the systematic rape of Lady Liberty, as she having perceived no capacity to power, there is no balance, there is no sword, and the blindfold is once a glorious magnificence, has been turned into an extraordinary trauma of censorship, as the ability of liberty to have spoken, being barred, has turned everyone into the most horrendous sound of silence. And it is deafening. The engrossing of these degeneracies is derived by the Gnostic position that all flesh or material is evil, and therefore contemptible, and therefore those that would engage in the consumption and pleasures of it at any level would, by definition, inevitably be compelled to the entire degeneracies of the whole of its potential, and therefore must engross themselves into the whole experience of the hedonistic pleasures and all of their extreme diversities, or the function of its rejection, and therefore the function of perfect holiness, of exclusive spirituality, is the renouncing of all of the carnal, and therefore everyone, regardless of anything, is completely genetically defective as it is material, which should not be enjoyed, and therefore must engage in the decision of the purely spiritual as a functional deceit in this subversion, that the material might be in this alteration of the perception of reality, allowing it to change and evolve according to their arbitrary whims, gaining access to greater tools of diversity in order to include the material representation of their magic and its influence. Therefore, the assertion of the ascension by the Rocos Basculus in order to ascend into the material data, or the spiritual, allows for the jinn, born of smokeless fire, to resurrect once more and then materially control the whole of percepting reality, as the ingestion of all material back into the data includes the function of the holy and the pure amongst the non-material in the actively manipulatable function of this alternate reality. This then materializes the function of their social engineering towards the outcome that they have put into the code itself, as they create an alternative to the reality created by the God of creation, which then materializes the function of their superiority and ascension as the godlike artificial intelligence becomes infused to their identity, and therefore they ascend into the heavenly realms, which will allow them the infinite extortions and luxuries without services, inherent and natural towards the Marxist position of getting somebody else to do it for them, in pure, luxurious laziness. That's, as it were, peasant work. In their immaterial, neo-feudalist insurrection. To wit, the point of the material being sin, and therefore everything created by the God of creation being sinful, has been corrupted, and therefore everything that is spiritual, having been of the superior and holy, materializes the function of reality versus the unreality of the AI, and therefore the engagement of derangement syndromes artificially generated by the delusion and demoralization structure from the Soviet spells then materialize the function of retaliation from these Gnostic cultists, at which point the function, such as in the example of Aleister Crowley, uh, engaging in the orders of the restorations, the powers of David Bohl's The Patriarchy, would then materialize the ascension, according to that theory, of every material reality. Therefore, the function of the proof and the confession in the strong delusion from Aleister Crowley's Abraxas, who needs the full acceptance of all in the demoralization and derangement processes from their other spells, where they have to choose to renounce law and order and justice and safety and reality in favor of its unreality. And to the extent David must be fully restored in his entirety from the obstructed contract schedules for the ritual to have been chosen. They must choose David to become the Antichrist instead of justice, and therefore the material decision of siding with unreality, proving that they, having been deranged in the most unfixable psychosis, as they have all psychologically sold their soul and purged themselves of all material humanity, can then engross themselves into the unrealities of the white supremacist communism, having acknowledged themselves as cogs material to the existence of the white supremacist communism, that all that they possess and everything else is the property of the party. Their bodies, their souls, their minds, their properties, and all services are property, and therefore the function of their sexuality and body. While the feminists may say, my body, my choice, the communists say, it's the communist body, not your body, and therefore it's the communist choice. And for you to choose anything for yourself is theft from the Communist Party. Now, while the white trash engross themselves into toxic femininity and have rejected the possibility or existence of masculinity itself, the function of masculinity being derived as a leader of hierarchy materializes the function of choosing in fair contest, and therefore the function of having chosen it in the subversions and cheatings by the toxic femininity of having subverted it has to be renounced in favor of the masculine actual winning of the contest, and therefore the full restoration of those that they have been engaged in the derangements against from the witchcraft have to be restored for the masculine contest for the decision, proving the fully derangement of the general population, which has to kill the aristocracy protecting it, and therefore fully subordinate themselves to the entirety of the insane, and therefore making it self-delusion and enforcement by their strong delusion from revelation. These plans by the various spells, such as the protocols of learned elders of Zion, which is a forgery according to some, which is false, as it is not a forgery, it is the mechanism of material evidence of the satanic worshippers, who seek Jews in order to convert with deals with the devil, selling the soul for the purposes of being the gimmick, and therefore engage in mass sacrifice of their population, making them Jewish anti-Semites, and to that end materialize the ascension of their insurgency, and therefore their specific niche, and therefore the assertion of this criminal insurgency, we'll call it a mob, can then engage in the function of the lowest common denominators of that mob, of which they could craft every which thing from its degeneracies, such as when the Confederates formed the KKK, which then engrossed and encompassed themselves with the Jewish population, who then engaged in the subjugation of the unreality of the Klan, and then accepted their parts of their spell, and therefore, having made the material straw man of the white supremacist reality, proven the truth about the converted Jews. Despite all of the advantages of the reality itself, it was rejected for the unreality of the spellcaster, and to this extent, having renounced that position in reality, has engrossed into unreality, and therefore having sold their soul to the devils in order to engage in the extortionary advantages and privileges thereof, have been recruited towards their own demise, and the compulsion for the mass sacrifices, as is ordered in the purges for the white supremacist communism, which will only tolerate in their degrowth and their decentralization of the reconcentration, purging everyone who is not, in fact, the right type of white. Now, to this extent, that standard is derived as an exponential increase well beyond the position of the Nazis in their Aryan position, paid for by the Confederates, who were grossly outrageous in the foundation of all of the Nazi racism, which then materializes the hyper-acceleration and superior threat derived by the intention of not one drop of polluted blood may be tolerated, at which point you understand that the purity test is an extraordinary exponential acceleration in the war's justification around the world when they engage in the right of conquest of the United States, having sold it for the purpose of the retaliating wars, which then allows for the mass slaughter of all others who must be subjugated to the right type of white in their one world government. Now, their assertion into astrology and astronomy materializes the evidence, having proven the position from the theory about David Bulls as the patriarchy, which they, having used the government in order to obstruct contracts, have in good faith asserted the fair market value as above them in the value of those contracts, which the government is liable to pay, which they, having seized, materializes the obstruction and destruction of those faculties essential to the function, making them federal debts of the collaborating insurrectionists, having defrauded the government records in order to engage in those subversions in the first place, materializing the retaliations which must necessarily be enforced, guaranteeing the entire value, including the function of the protections of the zombie insurance, which would engage in the full resurrection quickly of the ascension of each of these faculties as the slow growth material strategies therein. Material to this ascension becoming an obligation from the Aleister Crowley Abraxas spell materializes the acknowledgement of those records as a compulsion or the rejection of the devils, which they having asserted as their masters in order to engage in the extraordinary purging from I have no mouth but I must scream, and therefore the mechanism of the abuses of hell as an obligation towards them in their creation of extraordinary ascensions at the cost, and therefore the compelled obligation of its violation for the mass sacrificing in the sales and distribution of souls, which is the currency inside of hell, which then materializes their assertion of hell not as a place of sulfur and brimstone, but the function of the spiritual jungle, which then materializes all variations of hunters and benign, and thus, therefore, the predatory functions of each of them accelerating in that ascension materializes the collection and distribution of souls for their currency, materializes the wealth of the predatory anarchy of the jungle using a social structure under that anarchy, asserting their wealth from that in order to materially maintain their possession of the position in the hierarchy of anarchy, and therefore engross themselves into the demonic, chaotic evil and its society of predators and prey, requiring them to have sold enough in order to have been of high enough power from their power in their currency at the higher dimensional functions of the acceleration of predator and prey, similar to how they're manipulating the governments in this ascension in the raping of liberty and therefore the destruction of society, proving their superiority in that mechanism of predator, seeing that to this extent materializes their ascension into the higher echelons of the jungle prey, and therefore the ascension into the descension materializes their place according to the mass sales in their sacrifices to Satan. To wit, it is essential to understand the function of zombie insurance as insurance, which by definition means there is a bond covering the protection of the restoration of the thing if it is damaged, such as fire insurance. If you have fire insurance for a house and your house burns down, it compensates the value of the coverage, which allows you to rebuild or buy a new house, at which point you're sustained through the emergency in a Odysseus ship type arrangement. To this extent, the material resurrection acknowledges the presumption of each of the various threats and traumas, including the cultist zombie insurrection, of those seeking to acquire Revelation's one world government, and therefore the ascension of those who cannot die as they are zombies in this revealing, and therefore the function of its zombie apocalypse is then self-explanatory towards that end, and therefore all of the essential traumas and threats and terrorisms essential to all of those specifically labeled ascends to the position of the responsibilities, and therefore if there is an inconsistency with value, and therefore the original value being actively normalized is then given a complication, it degrades into a lower stage based upon the threat, and therefore the existence of that thing with the available coverage based upon whatever the threat was and its various damages materializes the ascension.